This is part 5, by the way, in a series that I've entitled Glorious Ruin. And as I mentioned, we've been making our way through the book of Job. And as I've said throughout this series, Job is a story about our suffering and God's sovereignty. The sovereignty of God, as I've mentioned before, is just a big Bible word for the fact that God's in complete control of all things, that regardless of how chaotic and messy things may be, there is a good and an all-in-control God behind all of it. And we may not understand what he's doing, why he's doing it, and we certainly may not like what we think he's allowing to happen. But he's doing things we can't see. And he's behind the scenes doing good things. And so the story of Job is a story about our suffering and God's sovereignty, our pain and God's providence or God's provision. It's about those intersections in life where our misery and God's mercy collide, where our grief and God's grace crash into each other, where catastrophe and compassion wreck. That's what Job's about. It's about being a broken person, living in a broken world with other broken people, but with a faithful God. It's about the fact that life is hard and pain is real, but grace abounds. That's what we've been looking at. Well, we saw in chapters 1 and 2 of Job, we saw Job suffer calamity after calamity after calamity. He lost everything. His children were killed, he lost his wealth, he lost his health, he lost everything. Everything that he had was gone. In one clean swoop, Job lost it all. And his initial response was good. In fact, it was surprising. It was somewhat shocking. After losing his children and after losing his wealth, after losing his health, he says, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord has given and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Amazing. It's not typically the way I, or probably any of you, respond in the face of calamity and tragedy and suffering, but that was Job's initial response. But when we get to chapter 3, as we saw a couple weeks ago, Job finally and understandably buckles. His humanness comes out in a very real and tangible way. For an entire chapter, all of chapter 3, he laments the day he was born. In fact, his pain is so intense that he regrets being alive. You ever felt like that? I have. I have felt like that on numerous occasions. When things are going bad, when I'm suffering, when I'm experiencing tragedy, calamity, grief, sadness, depression, despair, whatever, there are moments when I think it would be so much better to just simply not be alive. That's the way Job felt. He's emotionally shocked. He's physically disabled, and he is socially isolated. He's completely undone. We see him come unraveled in chapter 3. Interestingly, and I pointed this out a couple weeks ago, he never laments that he lost his stuff. That's not what is causing him the deepest pain, that he lost his stuff. He never asks, "Why have I lost everything?" But what he says to God is, "Why have you left me? Where are you?" He sounds like a lot of the Psalms. "Why have you forsaken me? Where have you gone? Why have you left me? Do you not care?" The root of Job's pain is not the loss of his possessions, but it's the perceived loss of God's presence. That's what's causing him the deepest pain. A huge part of Job's suffering is that God seems so distant. He seems so indifferent to Job's pain. God's gone missing, and Job doesn't understand why. To Job, God seems detached, he seems uncaring, he seems far away, and he seems unconcerned. And that is causing Job a tremendous amount of pain. It's the pain underneath the pain, the suffering underneath the suffering. Job felt alone in his pain, he felt alone in his heartache, he felt alone in this world, all alone. And at the end of chapter 2, we are introduced to 3 of Job's friends who had heard about his troubles. They all came from different places, from faraway places. And they had heard about his troubles, and they traveled very far to see him and to comfort him. And at the end of chapter 2, it says that from far off they could see him, but they didn't even recognize him. He was so undone. He was so disheveled. He was so broken down physically that they didn't even recognize him. And as they got closer and realized this really is Job, they just bust out in tears. They begin weeping and crying out because they can't believe this much tragedy has struck their friend. And when they finally reach him, they tear their clothes, they sit with him, and they don't say a word for 7 days. For 7 days, which at that time was the allotted amount of time for grieving the death of someone. They were grieving with Job as if he was dead. That's how intense his suffering was. His suffering was so intense, his pain was so visceral that they grieved with him as if he was dead. They wept with him. They listened to him. They listened to him pour his heart out. They listened to him express his frustration with God's perceived absence. They let him vent and cry and scream and grieve. They gave him room to express honestly how he was feeling. Now, you've heard me say this a number of times, but Job's friends were great counselors until they opened their mouth. When they were simply sitting there silently and weeping with him and listening to him, they were comforting him. They were great counselors until they opened their mouth. But as soon as they start talking, beginning in chapter 4, as soon as they start talking, they start trying to explain Job's pain, and that makes his pain worse. They immediately begin speculating as to why Job is suffering the way that he is. And while they all say a lot of things, the one big thing they all agree on is that Job wouldn't be suffering this badly if he wasn't being punished by God. That was the conclusion that they drew. By watching Job, seeing Job, listening to Job, the conclusion they drew was that Job would not be suffering this intensely if he wasn't being punished by God. And so they start probing. They begin acting like the worst possible accountability group. If you've ever been in one of these groups, I have. They're the worst. Where people sit around and they dig and they dig and they dig and they dig and they try to uncover the sin underneath the sin, underneath the sin, underneath the sin, underneath the sin. You get to a point, if you've ever been a part of these groups, where you kind of give them what they want. You give them a little bit so they think that's all of it, just to shut them up. Well, this is the way Job's friends were. They were acting as if they were the worst imaginable accountability group. They just start probing. Job, we know how God works. He rewards good people and he punishes bad people. Good people get good stuff. Bad people get bad stuff. You're clearly getting bad stuff. So what did you do wrong? What are the skeletons in your closet? You need to confess your sins. If you can just come clean and confess what it is you've done to deserve all of this, then maybe the suffering will come to an end. What have you done to deserve this? Talk about pouring salt in the wound. This guy has just suffered tragedy like these three friends probably never knew and would never know. And their comfort, their counsel is to probe this guy in excruciating pain, to try to find out the secret sins that he has committed that have caused God to punish him this way. This is their approach. Now, let me say this. Job's friends were not wrong to believe that sin has consequences. We all know that. But they were wrong to assume that Job was suffering because he was being punished for something he did. And that's the same assumption that Jesus' disciples made in John chapter 9. They're walking along, and they come across a man born blind. And Jesus' disciples instinctively, like Job's friends, say, Rabbi, teacher, who sinned? This man or his parents that he was born blind? Clearly, this guy was born blind because he's being punished, either for his sins or his parents' sins. So which one is it? And of course, Jesus says, he wasn't born blind because of his sin or his parents' sin. He was born blind so that at this very moment, in this very second, I would be able to demonstrate through his weakness just how strong God is. And then Jesus heals him. But it's the assumption that the disciples made, which is the same assumption that Job's friends make, which, to be honest with you, is oftentimes the same assumption that we make when someone is suffering. Part of the power of the book of Job is that it realistically addresses the painful questions of life. It's part of its power. That it doesn't brush lightly over pain. That it understands that tragedy and suffering are never simple issues. Regardless of what you may think or what you may have heard, Christianity does not offer pat answers to probing questions. And if you've ever been around a Christian person or someone who professes to believe in Jesus and they are as unsympathetic as that by trying to give pat answers to probing questions of pain and suffering, I'm sorry. Because that's not what Christianity does. Christianity does not offer pat answers to probing questions. We tend to reduce things to something manageable, something less than what's real. We pretend things aren't as bad as they are so that maybe we have the power to fix it, the problem, whatever it may be. Religious people reduce everything to a moral or spiritual issue. So when things go wrong, you get a list or you get a lecture. Well, if you just do this, do that, clean up your act, fix this, fix that, you'll be fine. So religious people reduce everything to a moral or spiritual issue. So when things go wrong, you get a list, you get a lecture. Non-religious people reduce everything to a physical or psychological issue. So when things go wrong, you get a pill. The problem is God never reduces things like that. He never reduces things like that. He's not simplistic that way because we are spiritual and physical, moral and psychological. Life is complex. Problems are complex. Pat answers are insensitive. Pat answers are inaccurate. So in chapter 4 of Job, chapter 4, verse 8, where is it? I got to go all the way back to the Old Testament. Chapter 4, verse 8, his friend Eliphaz summarizes the posture of all the three friends when he says, "As I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same." What's he saying there? He's saying, from my vantage point, in the experience that I've had, the things that I've seen, what I've seen is that good people get good stuff and bad people get bad stuff. That's his simplistic view of the way life works. That's his simplistic view of the way God works. I mean, what's interesting about that is he starts off by saying, "As I have seen," as if that gives him some authority. I mean, that's like, saying, from what I can see, this is the way life is. Well, there's a whole lot you can't see. So maybe your conclusions are wrong. Maybe it's not as simple as that. Maybe it's a lot more complex than that. You see, I think, as I was thinking about this yesterday, that we're a lot more like Job's friends than we want to admit. The counsel of Job's friends sounds a lot like stuff people inside the church tend to say, believe it or not. It's amazing to me that when things are tough, there is never a shortage of opinions from others trying to explain the pain they are not suffering. Okay, I mean, that is why, by the way, that is why I say jokingly but very truthfully that the sanctuary is a recovery place masquerading as a church. And the reason I say that is because one of the things that I think we could learn, that the church could learn from recovery groups, Alcoholics Anonymous and a host of others, is that you would never, ever find a non-alcoholic leading an AA group, ever. What qualifies the person to lead it is their own struggle with alcohol. They understand the suffering. They understand the struggle. And yet, inside the church, we want the clean person standing on stage, which you guys know is not true here, okay? Telling the dirty people how to live their lives and become clean like him. Okay, that's typically the way things go. That's not who we are. That's not what we want to be. That's not what we need. To be honest with you, that's not even what we want. It's always surprising to me. Maybe it shouldn't be, but there is never a shortage of opinions from other people trying to explain the pain they are not suffering. It's kind of like, when Stacy and I were up here a number of weeks ago talking about marriage, and I said at the beginning, by way of introduction, that it may seem strange to some people that a pastor and his wife who have both been divorced and remarried and have made a mess of their lives in a variety of different ways, as it pertains to marriage in particular, would be on stage talking about marriage. I mean, what in the world could they teach us? What could they teach us? They've really mucked it up. What in the hell do they have to say about marriage? And I said that morning that that impulse, that instinct to react or respond that way is an indicator, I think, that there's a sort of a disconnect. We want people who haven't struggled, or we expect people who haven't struggled to be the instructors to us strugglers. But that's not the way it works. I can tell you that on just about any and every occasion, I have felt like throwing in the towel when it comes to life. When I've experienced something tragic, when I've experienced pain, suffering, whatever the case may be, it has been those people who have experienced what I've experienced, who have lived through what I've lived through, that have been the biggest help to me. Not the person who did it all right, but the person who screwed up like I did. Those are the people that have helped me the most. You see, unlike Job's friends, good counseling involves a healthy mixture of tenderness and tears. Listening and learning. There's so much that we don't see. So much we can never understand. Eliphaz says, from what I see, yeah, but that's so limited. Your view is only one person. C.S. Lewis said that understanding the way God operates is kind of like walking down the beach and looking at the ocean. You can see water as far as the eye can see, but what you're seeing is a fraction of what's actually there. Well, that's kind of what is happening here. Eliphaz says, from what I can see, and that should actually disqualify him from sharing his opinion. Because, well, from what you can see, but there is so much more that you can't see. There's so much more going on. So most of the time, instead of trying to explain why someone is suffering, just shut up and weep with those who weep. His friends were great counselors until they opened their mouth. I don't know if you remember that old skit, probably early, mid-90s, Saturday Night Live skit. It wasn't really a skit. It was Deep Thoughts from Jack Handey. Do you remember that? Does anyone remember that? Okay, it's really stupid, super funny, but stupid. There's one that I find very relevant to what I'm talking about today. It says, this is Deep Thoughts from Jack Handey. If a kid asks where rain comes from, I think a cute thing to tell him is, God is crying. And if he asks why God is crying, another cute thing to tell him is probably because of something you did. now we laugh, understandably, because it's so stupid. But most of us are naturally governed by this kind of thinking as it pertains to God. We just are. I mean, we're suffering because we've done something wrong, or we're not praying enough, or we're not obeying enough. If we would just confess more, obey more, do more, be more holy, pray more, love better, try harder, we wouldn't suffer as much. Or the flip side of that is that, God gives good things to good people and bad things to bad people. I hear a version of this all the time. If you want the blessing of God, believe more, obey more. If your life is a constant struggle, it's because your faith is weak. You can't expect God to do good for you if you don't do good for him. We hear versions of this stuff all the time. Believe. The reason you don't have is because you don't believe enough. Believe more. Believe harder and you can have it. It can be yours. Health, wealth, prosperity. It can all be yours if you just exercise more faith. We hear stuff like this all the time. But when we subscribe to this paradigm of cosmic scorekeeping, we're no longer talking about Christianity. We're talking about karma at that point. This divine this for that, that's not Christianity. That's karma. And this karmic approach to suffering is the approach of Job's friends. Now, let me reiterate something I said a few minutes ago. Let me be clear about this. We do experience the consequences of our actions. Okay, that goes without saying. We know that to be true. Okay, if I drive my car at 110 miles an hour down I-95 to see my son Nate on Tuesday afternoon, which I've never done, by the way, and I get pulled over and I get a massive speeding ticket, well, I deserve that. I mean, I broke the law. I was going double the speed limit. I deserve, okay? So that we know that to be true. I mean, you stick a fork in a light socket, you're gonna get shocked. Okay, if you drink too much, you're gonna feel sick. We know that all of our actions have consequences, whether they're good or bad. Destructive decisions have destructive results. Trust me, I know. But this is a very different thing than concluding that the suffering we experience is God getting us back for the bad stuff we've done. That's not what's going on. We know, for instance, Job's friends don't know this. Job doesn't even know this, which is why he's confused. But we know because as readers, we read what took place behind the scenes in chapter 1 and 2. And we know that Job is not suffering because of something bad he did. In fact, chapters 1 and 2 make it clear that he was a good guy. You could even say that he was suffering because he was good, not because he was bad. You know how it went. The devil shows up, approaches God, and the devil says, I know why this Job guy of yours worships you and loves you and serves you. You've made him rich. You've given him all this stuff. You've made his life easy. That's the reason why he loves you. That's the reason why he worships you. And so God says, that's not the reason why he loves me, and that's not the reason why he worships me, and I'll prove it to you. I will allow you to take away his stuff. And in the end, what you will see is that I stick with Job and Job sticks with me. That's why he's suffering. It's not because of something bad he did. Now, his friends don't know that. Job doesn't know that. But we know that. So we can say for certain that his friends are wrong, just like Jesus' disciples were wrong. His friends were wrong. What God was doing by allowing the devil, however that mysterious thing went down. I don't understand it, but there are a lot of questions that I don't have answers to as it pertains to that conversation, where it was, what was actually happening. I don't know. I just know what it says here, and it says that wherever God was, the devil shows up and accuses Job of only worshiping God and loving God because of everything God's given him, and God gives him permission. And then in the end, what we will see is that God's reputation is vindicated. The strength of God comes out in and through Job's weakness. Job sticks with God. God sticks with Job. And the same thing happens in John chapter 9. Who sinned, this man or his parents? And God says, that's not the reason this guy was born blind. He was born blind so that I could showcase my strength right now and prove to you and everybody else that God is God. Same thing. Same exact thing. So we know that Job isn't suffering because he was a bad guy. So why do so many Christians believe that God doles out misery in proportion to our sin? Why? Why do so many Christians believe that pain is God's payback for bad behavior? I have conversations with people like this all the time. People who have been weighed down because they've been taught to believe that they're suffering because God's upset with them. If they would have just made a left instead of making a right, if they would have crossed that T and dotted that I, if they wouldn't have had that abortion, if they wouldn't have married that person, if they wouldn't have taken that job, if they wouldn't have, whatever the case may be. We talk to people like this all the time. They think, I'm being punished because I screwed up. God is punishing me because I screwed up. I don't understand why so many of us assume, like Job's friends, that the suffering we endure is God's punishment for what we've done. I'll tell you why. Because we don't truly believe that God is a God of grace. We just don't. He's a God of fairness. He's a God of justice. He's a God who rights wrongs. And that's it. We don't see him primarily and fundamentally as a God of grace, the one and only unlosable lover to repeat offenders like you and me. We don't see him that way. There is no grace whatsoever in Job's friends' view of God. None. This is a God who is punishing you for screwing up. And we'll look at next week that the solution to this, according to Job's friends, is clean up your act. Make wrong things right. Fix what you broke. You do all of that. You do all of the necessary work that you need to do. Then and only then will God again welcome you with open arms. Until then, you're going to suffer. That's their understanding. Now, let me say this. I've made this connection before, that the fact that there is no vertical condemnation does not mean that there are no horizontal consequences, okay? And the presence of horizontal consequences does not imply vertical condemnation. That's the mistake we make. We experience the horizontal consequences of foolish decisions, sinful decisions, bad decisions, whatever, and we automatically conclude that this is God's way of punishing us, condemning us, whatever the case may be. No, it's just you screwed up and you're suffering the consequences. God said do it this way, you did it this way, and now you're suffering the consequences for doing it that way. Okay? I've shared this with you before, but a number of years ago, I was standing in front of a group of people. It was a midweek service at a local church, and I was telling my story, and I was talking about how God's grace meets us in our darkest places when we are most desperate, that God's office of grace is at the end of our rope. That's where we discover God, most of us anyway, when we're flat on our back, at the end of all of our resources. And I was sharing that and telling my story in the process, and then I opened it up for questions. And one guy, his hand shot up, and he said, okay, you've just told us your story, which involves infidelity on my part, my first marriage, which ended in divorce. And so this guy said, well, if what you just said about God and his grace are true, then why wouldn't we all have affairs? And I looked at him and I said, because they'll ruin your life. That's why. It's not because God loves you more before or loves you less afterwards. God's love for you is not dependent on what you do or don't do. It's dependent on what Jesus has done for you. So you're in forever, affair free or not. That's not the issue. The issue is when you make dumb, foolish, destructive decisions, you reap dumb, foolish, destructive consequences. So if you don't want a speeding ticket, don't drive 110 miles an hour down to Boca to work out with your son Nate. Don't do it, okay? This has never happened to me before, okay? But I mean, so I think it's important to understand that no vertical condemnation does not mean no horizontal consequences, and the presence of horizontal consequences does not imply vertical condemnation. It's very important to keep those two planes, clear. You see, the funny thing is, the sins that you think God is still punishing you for, he doesn't even remember. He's not even thinking about it. You're thinking about it way more than he is. That's what Hebrews 8:12 says. For I will forgive their wickedness and remember their sins no more. No more. Because of Jesus, your sin is cast into the sea of God's forgotten memory. Robert Capon put it this way. If God has announced anything in Jesus, I love this. If God has announced anything in Jesus, it is that he has pensioned off the bookkeeping department permanently. We think of God as this cosmic scorekeeper. So many bad things from us deserve so many bad things from God. So many good things from us deserve so many good things from God. But if God has announced anything in Jesus, it's that he has pensioned off the bookkeeping department permanently. See, Christians believe that the link between suffering and deserving was suffered once and for all at the cross. Once and for all. It's a done deal. The ledgers were put away and all accounts were settled. God is not making us pay him back for our sin. When we sin, God is not making us come good on our debt. When we suffer, we think, okay, God is beating me up now because I have sinned, and that's okay, because if God beats me up enough, maybe he will then love me. I've talked to people who say these very things. It burdens me, it grieves me. I think to myself, who taught you this? I want to go find that person. No, Jesus died for your sin. He's been punished in your place. All of the punishment that is deserved has already been taken. God is not making you pay him back. We don't believe in karma. We don't believe in penance. We believe in Jesus. We believe in grace. I have a friend named Nadia who wrote this, and I absolutely love it. She said, James Allison, who's a theologian, a Catholic theologian, James Allison describes faith not as intellectually ascending to a set of theological propositions, but he describes faith as relaxing. Relaxing in the love and presence of God, in the way that we relax in the presence of someone we are certain is fond of us. Isn't that beautiful? That's what faith is. Faith is, it's relaxing. It's relaxing in the presence of God in the same way we relax when we are with someone that we are absolutely certain is fond of us, that loves us unconditionally. So, regardless of what you are guilty of or how miserably you have failed, because of Jesus, God is now and will forever be fond of you. You will continue to experience hardships in this life. You will suffer as a broken person living in a broken world with other broken people. But your suffering is not the result of God taking out his frustration on you for bad stuff you've done. That's not what it is. Frederick Buechner, who is a writer who actually recently died and who for a time lived in this area, believe it or not. In fact, Lori Frost, who goes to this church, was one of his caretakers for a time. Wrote a number of books, but he once described grace this way when he wrote about the Apostle Paul hearing God's voice on the road to Damascus. Remember Paul before he was Paul, when he was Saul, and he's on his road to Damascus to get rid of all these Christians, and God meets him there, knocks him off his high horse, reveals himself to Saul, and Saul becomes Paul, and the rest is history. And so Frederick Buechner described grace this way when he wrote about the Apostle Paul hearing God's voice on the road to Damascus. He said this, Paul discovered that all the brownie points he had been trying to rack up as a super Pharisee had been pointless. God did business with you not because of who you were, but because of who he was. At a moment in his life when he had the least reason to expect it, Paul was staggered by the idea that no matter who you are or what you've done, God wants you on his side. There is nothing you have to do or be. It's on the house. It goes with the territory. God has justified you. He's lined you up. That's grace. It's all in the house. I love that. I mean, once again, we see this over and over again in the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, no matter where you look. You see this over and over again, and I've pointed this out on numerous occasions, that when we are at our worst, God gives us his best. What does Paul say in Galatians? While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. What does he say when he's introducing communion in Corinthians? On the night when he was betrayed, Jesus took bread and broke it and said, "This is my body broken for you," and he gives it. On the night he was betrayed. Saul on the road to Damascus, what's he going to do? He's not going to worship God. He's going to get rid of Christians because he thinks they're heretics. They're imposters. It's when he is on the road to Damascus to murder Christians that God meets him, opens his eyes, and loves him into being. Over and over again, we see this throughout the Bible. So the Bible does not support this idea that God is doling out misery in proportion to our sin. It doesn't. You will suffer, as I said, because this world and everything in it, including you, is fallen and broken. But your suffering is not divine payback. In God's presence, you can relax, even in the face of your suffering. I've said this before, that there is no promise in the Bible that God will relieve us of our pain here and now. He won't. But he does promise to be with us when we're struggling. He promises to walk with us, to be with us, to love us, and to accept us in spite of whatever it is we're going through. Whether it is self-imposed, whether we're experiencing consequences because of what we ourselves have done, or we're experiencing consequences because of what someone else has done, or something else that has happened, it doesn't matter. God is with us, loving us, caring for us, supplying us with everything we need according to his riches and grace. I like to think about this because I think it's so counterintuitive that it just shocks me into belief. That in God's economy of grace, the bad get the best, the worst inherit the wealth, and the slave becomes a son. The whore becomes a bride. You see all of these terminologies in the Bible. I mean, in God's economy of grace, it doesn't make sense to us. It's not the way we operate. It's not the way we think. It's not the way this world works. And so we conclude, because this isn't the way the world works, this must not be the way God works either. But in God's economy of grace, the bad get the best. The worst inherit the wealth. The last are first. The first are last. So before God, you are clean. Okay? Your pardon is full. Your pardon is final. There are no strings attached. There are no ifs. There are no ands. There are no buts. There are no conditions. And seriously, there are no paybacks. There are no boomerangs. You're in. Let's pray.